Does it? So I put it in the wrong place. All right, I will switch that up later. Thanks for telling me. I'll honestly just relabel them. It'll be easier than re-entering. Yeah.
They're all like weighted the same.
They are, yeah, and everything's point space, so it's not like, yeah, percentage thing, but thank you for letting me know. I will switch that up. That's so interesting because it was right next in where I enter, it was right next to exam 1. So I must have put them in out of order at some point. Does it say 2? I will check it out and see what I effed up. We can just chalk that up to user problems. I don't think I can even blame Blackboard for that one, honestly. But thank you all for letting me know. Alrighty. Oh, we got about a minute. I'll wait to see if anybody else rolls in. Alrighty. Okay, so for everybody who just joined us, I have done your exams finally. Thank you for your patience with me. I try to be efficient, but I just haven't been, perfectly honest. So y'all did really well on this one in general, honestly, like the majority of folks got A's, which was great. Only a few folks failed. And I put both the average and the median up here because there are a couple people who just didn't do the exam. So the zeros are dragging the average down even more. It would be about there if I had the zeros. So this is great. Excellent. Your next exam will be 4 chapters, but you're also going to have a week to do it because I'll hand it out the last day of class, right, our last actual day, and then our exam period is the following Monday. So you'll have a whole week to work on it, and it will also still be the same amount of points.
So that exam period will come in and give it to you.
That exam period, you're gonna come and do your presentations about your infographics. So, and like, that shouldn't take very long, because 5 minutes or under for each of you. So yeah, if you haven't turned in your topic for your infographic yet, definitely do that so I can give you some feedback. Some people have turned in your outlines in the past couple days. That's great. I will look at those soon and give you feedback on those. That was technically due Monday, but again, just get it in so that I can give you some feedback. Yeah, and the last exam is not cumulative, it's just the 4 chapters we're covering since exam 2, and it's the same amount of points, so it's still 100 points. So it just means that, like, typically I just have 10 multiple choice for each chapter. It'll be a little bit fewer so we can get all 4 chapters in. This is like the part of the semester that I do not like, because I need to have like a real earnest talk with everybody. A lot of you are doing really well, which is awesome, but if you look at your Blackboard gradebook right now, and it's got a really low grade, and I'll kind of talk to people online too, because I don't remember who's where grade wise right now. Be real honest with yourself about whether you think you're going to be able to pull that up to a passing grade by the time, you know, we got like a month left, basically. You know, not that I want people to drop my class, but I also don't want you to end up with an F on your transcript if it's just not realistic for you to pull that grade up. And if you have questions about that, please shoot me an email, grab me after class, you know, set up a meeting. But I believe Friday is the last day you can drop a class and still get a W. So if you get a W on your transcript, it's basically like you never took the class. After Friday, you would get an automatic WF, which goes into your GPA like an X. So that's why I like to give you all the heads up. So like if you haven't done any of the Connect stuff and you don't think you're going to be able to before the end of the semester, I would probably recommend dropping just because that's a big chunk of your grade. Again, if you have any questions, please contact me. I'm totally willing to talk it over with you. I would love all of you to finish the semester with me and get A's, but I know for some of you that's just not realistic. So I just want to be real honest about that. Alrighty, that's the womp part of the class. Now we get to talk about disorders, which is a little more fun. And put on our slideshow here. So on Monday, we had been talking about depression and talked about major depressive disorder, which is the most commonly diagnosed disorder. So now we're going to talk about persistent depressive disorder in a little more detail. So if you have persistent depressive disorder, you have depressed mood for at least 2 years, most of the day, more days than not. So it doesn't have to be every day like it does for a major depressive episode, but it's got to be most of the time. And it can be you reporting it, or it can be other people saying, hey, this person's been depressed for this long. And you only have to have 2 of these symptoms, unlike 5 in major depressive disorder. So poor appetite or overeating, insomnia or hypersomnia, low energy, low self-esteem, poor concentration, feelings of hopelessness.
Is it like the other one where it has to be one equal person?
No, yeah, that's a really good question. No, so you do have to have the depressed mood. So I guess that's sort of the same as that. But yeah, anhedonia is not really a part of this. So it can be any of those 2. That's a really good question. You have to have never been without symptoms for 2 months or more during those 2 years, and never had a manic or hypomanic episode, because if you have, then you are diagnosed with cyclothymia. And again, we're going to see this over and over and over and over, significant distress or impairment. Now, this is not an official diagnosis, but this is certainly something people can experience and is really hard to treat, and that's double depression, where you can be diagnosed with persistent depressive disorder and then get a full-blown depressive episode on top of it. So you end up, often you have the persistent depressive disorder develop first. And then you get a major depressive episode on top. It's somewhat common. But the unfortunate thing is it's associated with fairly severe psychopathology. And it means it's also not going to respond that well to treatment. So this can be really problematic. And it's things like this that keep us researching what are better treatments. And we're going to talk about psychotherapy starting next week. But, one of the things that, we have a whole bunch of things that work for depression, but they still don't work for everybody. Right. So this is why you have people looking into like micro dosing with hallucinogens and things like that as something that might help people who have things like this. All right, so now we're going to talk about the bipolar and mood and other related disorders in more detail. And I have a video here of various people who have bipolar disorder talking about their experiences.
Somebody can point to a broken ankle on an X-ray machine and say that's what's wrong. When it's happening inside your mind, it feels like it's not a real thing. And I think that that's where a lot of the stigmas come from.
I am bipolar.
I am bipolar.
I'm bipolar, but I'm not a ticking time bomb.
We're not all depressed.
But I'm not just gonna snap out of it through positive thinking.
I'm bipolar.
Bipolar.
But I'm not unpredictable.
I'm not fragile or delicate.
I'm bipolar,
But I'm not a zombie.
I don't attract chaos.
I don't define myself by an illness.
I'm bipolar, but I'm not a drug addict.
Just because someone is on medication doesn't mean that they are a drug addict.
We all experience emotions.
I'm not off my meds just because I'm emotional.
And I'm not trying to be trendy with my cool mental illness.
But I am not your manic pixie dream girl.
But I'm not looking for attention.
I am not a victim of my emotions.
If you feel like you can't deal with things on your own, it can be as easy as talking to somebody about it.
I promise you that when you speak and ask for help and talk about it, you will realize that you are not the only person dealing with this.
I didn't give up.
You are stronger than you think you are.
Self-care is not selfish.
You are not alone.
I have bipolar disorder, but I'm not weak or using it as a cop-out to not live life. I live life large.
I am a dad, a husband, and a family man.
I am capable of having a long-term relationship.
I've had a lot of relationships, like a lot.
I'm bipolar,
And I'm a vegan.
and I'm a cat mom.
Making people laugh and laughing is my favorite thing.
I am an advocate for mental illness and for equality for everyone.
And I'm great with kids. I'm a nanny and a camp counselor, and I rock it.
I'm single.
I am a veteran. I believe in serving people and helping people.
I'm a feminist.
I lead a completely normal life.
I'm a human being. We're all human beings.
I'm human, like you.
I have bipolar disorder, and
I am happy with who I am.
It is so not who I am.
it's just a part of who I am. And I'd say that I am pretty happy.
So I really like that just because it tries to normalize it, right? Instead of like, especially things like bipolar disorder, we tend to think of the way movies portray them, that they're scary or overwhelming. And like a lot of people live with these things and carry on pretty normal lives, right? So the two diagnoses for bipolar disorder are bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. So for bipolar 1, if you've ever had a full manic episode, those ones that last 7 days or so severe you need to be hospitalized, you're diagnosed with bipolar 1. And it may be preceded by and or followed by hypomanic episodes and or major depressive episodes. And again, significant distress or impairment in your life. Bipolar 2 is where you've had at least one hypomanic episode and at least one major depressive episode. Because we need to make sure it's not cyclothymia, if it's just persistent depressive disorder. You've never had a full manic episode. As soon as you have one, your diagnosis is bipolar 1. So bipolar 2 can be a little bit less interfering with your life, but certainly still problematic. All right, so now one of the things that I talk about is death by suicide. I've always talked about this, but I think it's especially important to talk about now because unfortunately, during the past couple of years, there have been a rash of suicides. We've had one on our campus. I know within the student athlete community, there have been several. I know, for example, there was a softball player at JMU who died by suicide last year. And so this is not my area of research. And so I am still learning all the proper language, and so the slides may not reflect that, but I'll try to use it out loud if that makes sense. We try now to say died by suicide rather than committed suicide, so that it's not like a crime, if that makes sense. We try not to stigmatize it. Suicide is pretty common. Unfortunately, it's the 8th leading cause of death in the USA. It's unfortunately very common among veterans. I forget what the current number is, but at some point it was like 2 or 3 veterans died every day by suicide. There are some gender differences. So males complete more suicides than females. So 3 times as many men actually die by suicide than women, but females attempt suicide more often than males. So 3 times more women actually attempt it. So you might ask, like, how does that work out? Well, it's the choice of method and attempt to die by suicide. So men tend to use things that are, if we think back to our gender chapter, manly and masculine, right, in our society. Shooting themselves, stabbing themselves, hanging themselves. Whereas women tend to ingest poisons, drug overdoses, self-harm, and all of those can be deadly, but also take a longer time. So it's more likely someone will find you, essentially. Guns are implicated in 2/3 of men who die by suicide, but they're also implicated in 40% of women who die by suicide. One thing that I should say too is that even if you choose a very lethal method, it doesn't mean that you will actually die. When I was on my placement year, my 4th year of grad school, I worked with my supervisor to see a young woman who had actually shot herself through the head and survived. She blinded herself. So the first thing she said when she woke up is like, why aren't the lights on? And it was very evident she wasn't really ready to talk about it, but we just tried to offer her some support. Overwhelmingly, we see these rates among Caucasian folks, European American folks, and then Indigenous folks. And that's, I think, unfortunately, largely because of the horrible ways Indigenous people have been treated by colonization throughout history. And unfortunately, rates are increasing. So it's also a leading cause of death worldwide. Over 2/3 of a million people die by suicide every year. With at least 31,000 in the US alone. And sometimes it's hard to tell, right? If someone's car crashed into a tree, did they fall asleep on the wheel or was it purposeful, right? There are many more people who, this is weird language, but this is the language that's used, unsuccessfully attempt, right? Like to define dying by suicide as successful is an odd phrasing, right? But a lot of people attempt without actually dying. Sometimes these are called parasuicides or parasuicidal behavior. And there are about 600,000 attempts per year in the US. And that is honestly probably an underestimate. One of the things that I do in my, as for my community service in my life is I volunteer with a Lifeline. And so many people have told me like they attempted suicide, attempted to die by suicide and just woke up and like no one had found them. So as you can see, it does differ by race. And as you can see, there's this dramatic increase for white men in particular at the end of life. And some people argue that this is because white men are used to being the ones with all the power and respect. And then in our society, we're not very respectful of our elders, right? We try to put them sort of out of sight, out of mind, things along those lines. And I think this is why you'll see more men than women working past the sort of average age of retirement if they have the ability to retire. So suicide is the intentional ending of one's own life. That is the very basic definition. So it's a self-inflicted death where you make an intentional, direct, and conscious effort to end your own life. And so this latter definition was proposed by Schneidman, who's one of the leading researchers in the area of death by suicide. So these are some myths about suicide, and I always think it's really important to cover these because I think if you have a friend you suspect might be contemplating death by suicide, it can be really hard to know what should I do, what shouldn't I do, right? A big myth is that people who talk about suicide won't do it. If they mention it, take them seriously, right? Or that there are no warning signs. I mean, some people hide it really well, but for the vast majority of people, you can tell there's psychological pain there, right? It's not always easy to establish the motives for why someone died by suicide. If they don't leave a note, especially, we have no idea, right? There's this myth that everyone who dies by suicide has major depressive disorder, and that's not true. There's a whole host of mental illnesses people will have, and in fact, big chunk of people who died by suicide didn't have anything diagnosable. It was just their circumstances felt overwhelming. People think, oh, someone with a terminal illness, physical illness won't die by suicide. Not true. This is a big area we see where people feel guilt, feel like they're a burden on their families, or just want their pain to end, right? And for this reason, some states have actually introduced what they call death with dignity laws, where your doctor can prescribe you an overdose of something like morphine, and you can go home and choose when you pass away. Some people are like, oh, it's so crazy, it's so psychotic, why would someone do this? To the person who dies by suicide, like that is the most logical explanation to them, right? Oftentimes they've spent a lot of time thinking about this decision. Some people think, oh, if you start to feel better, if this seems like you're doing better, then they're not gonna attempt to die by suicide. Not always. Sometimes it's like when they've made that decision, they're like at peace with themselves. Yeah.
In this class and then in a social work class I'm in, we're learning like the exact same things like right now, which kind of helps them both.
Oh, yeah.
But we learned that people with bipolar disorder, they're like most at risk when they're going back up to like a like happy state because they one like have the most energy, and then two, they're like most terrified to go back down.
Right.
So it's like when they're most at risk, not when they're like at their lowest.
That makes so much sense. I hadn't heard that statistic before, but it makes so much sense. This is one of the reasons why you all, I don't know if you all would have even heard about this because it happened in the 90s, but there are several antidepressant medications that have what we call the black box warning on them. And it basically says like taking this could increase your experience of suicidality. And what it was exactly that essentially when you start taking antidepressants, you get more energy. And so when you're really depressed, you don't have the energy to even like carry out a plan to die by suicide. But then like when you take this medication, it might give you that energy without actually like making you feel better yet. Because it can take about 6 weeks for antidepressants to fully kick in. So yeah, there's actually, especially among adolescents, it seemed like that was the biggest thing. So there's a warning on certain antidepressants related to that. This is why I'm always a proponent of like, if you're gonna be on medication, let's also get you in therapy, right? Get you some support. Suicide is a lonely event. I mean, sometimes it is, but as we saw with the cults when we talked about them, right? Unfortunately, there have been cases of mass suicide, like Heaven's Gate or Jonestown. Suicidal people always clearly want to die. You know, sometimes they're really conflicted, but again, to them in that moment, this just seems like the best choice. Thinking about suicide is rare. No, a lot of people have thought about it, at least in passing. You know, that doesn't mean that they would ever do it. But I think there's a lot of stigma about even thinking about it, that thinking about it somehow makes you like really mentally unstable. And unfortunately, it is something that passes through a lot of people's minds. This is a big one. I think a lot of people worry that like, if I ask someone about suicide, that'll like give them ideas. And then they'll go over the edge and then they'll try to die by suicide. And no, and in fact, most of the time, if you talk to them about it, it actually helps. Like that's the whole purpose of the place where I volunteer, is that like, if we can get people talking about it, and supporting them, oftentimes, at least temporarily, that can make them reconsider. And people will do this. So, you know, women who attempt to die by overdose or self-harm or things along those lines, people will be like, oh, they didn't really want to kill themselves. They're just trying to get attention. Like anytime anyone tries to die by suicide, take it seriously, right? And so for people who have a lot of those parasuicidal behaviors, we have to really work with them in therapy to advocate for themselves so that like they're not always getting inpatient hospitalized, because it's really hard to work on living in the real world if you're never in it, right? If you're always being inpatient hospitalized. These are some of the predictors of suicide, particularly among adolescents. So yeah, depressive disorders up there, but also alcoholism. If you're talking about it, yeah. And the religious ideas isn't all, it's religious ideas related to the only way I can be with God is through, you know, dying by suicide, that type of suicide bombers, that type of thing. If they've ever attempted before, the best predictor in general of future behavior is past behavior. So take that seriously. If they're talking about lethal methods, if they feel really isolated, I think this is why we saw an upswing during the pandemic, because unfortunately a lot of people felt isolated. Hopelessness and just cognitive rigidity means like black and white thinking. You're having a hard time seeing the gray area. People who are impulsive, as we saw from that one chart, older white men are at the higher risk. If there has been a death by suicide recently, or in your family, there might even be some genetics. This is where we got to be really careful. And so, for example, unfortunately, a few years back, our minister at the church I go to died by suicide. It was nothing to do with the church. She was actually going through a messy divorce and her kids weren't talking to her. And it was all related to that. And we were very fortunate to have a church member who was a police officer, and he came in and he said, okay, for the death notification, we need to be really transparent, because suicide can be contagious. If you're not, like, if you don't just put it out there that they died by suicide. And so that's something that I have tried to do when it's touched this community as well, is just be really open about it and hope that people feel comfortable being open about it as well. Because unfortunately, like, for example, after Kurt Cobain died by suicide, unfortunately, we saw an uptick in young people dying by suicide from that modeling. Economic or work problems. When the stock market crashed in 1929, there was a rash of suicides on Wall Street. Marital problems, as I just mentioned with our minister, stressful events, anger, aggression, irritability. Sometimes psychosis, you notice it's pretty far down on this list. Not everyone who's schizophrenic or has other psychosis is going to do this. And again, physical illness, especially if it's terminal. So some warning signs, and fully admitting before I read these, that these are really tough because a lot of these are things that college students just sort of experience, like fatigue. Let's be honest, right? College is exhausting. Sleep loss or distinct changes in sleep patterns, a decline in school performance, social withdrawal is a huge one. Loss of appetite, giving away their possessions, big thing, right? And writing goodbye letters to friends. So if you know someone who's exhibiting these signs, you can refer them to the counseling center. They're limited in what they can do for someone who's actively wanting to die by suicide. If anyone needs a reference, there's a great new service, there we go, available in Chesapeake. It's a company called Rawls and Associates. It's a big psychological firm, and they are essentially like a patient first, but for mental health. So you can go in, get an interview, and see someone for therapy that day, which is really great. And oftentimes can keep people from having to be like inpatient hospitalized, right? Which is often expensive and not always helpful, depending. So we have an alum who works there and she told me about it, and it's a really great service. All right, and then I have Tim Gunn, who you all might know if you ever watched Project Runway, or he and Heidi Klum have a new show called The Cut on Prime. But he's going to talk about his attempt to die by suicide.
Hi, I'm Tim Gunn, and I have a very important message for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and questioning youth. And that is, it gets better. It really does. And you may be thinking, what does Tim Gunn understand about my anguish, about my despair, about how I'm feeling, about my particular time and place in the world right now? Well, I'll share with you, as a 17-year-old youth who was in quite a bit of despair, I attempted to kill myself. And I'm very happy today that that attempt was unsuccessful. But at the time, it's all that I could contemplate. I thought I need to end things right now. And I have to tell you, when I woke up the next morning after taking more than 100 pills, I was in a whole other level of despair. I thought, I shouldn't be here. This isn't what was meant to be. I frankly just wanted to start life all over again. There are people who can help you. You cannot do this alone. That's another very profound message that I want to give to all of you. It really requires a collaboration between you and the people who love you, the people who you can depend upon, no matter who they are, as mentors. In my case, it took a very serious intervention to help me, and it was the result of the botched suicide attempt, to be blunt. I am a huge advocate for the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is a suicide prevention hotline for GLBT and questioning youth, and please visit their website, thetrevorproject.org, and seek them out. Your identity will be protected. You don't have to worry about getting parents involved if you're so inclined. I understand the desperation. I understand the despair, and I understand how isolated you can feel. And you have a lot of, get very emotional, people who really care about you, and I'm included in that group. So reach out, get help, you're not alone. It will get better, I promise.
And so obviously there are
Hi, I'm Tim.
organizations like the Trevor
Hi, I'm
Project
Tim.
that are very specific to certain subgroups. But there are also other organizations that are more broad. A really great new service that was put into place just this year is, if you're suicidal, you can now just dial 988, just like you would dial 911 to get to emergency services. And they will connect you with a suicide prevention hotline. And I know that at least when this used to be an 800 number, there was like a specific number you could press, like if you were a veteran and you could talk to a veteran who'd been through similar things. And that's been really helpful to people. So this is really great, and a great service. So tell your friends, and most of these sites are not collecting, you know, information on you. They might ask for a name just so they can connect with you. It's up to you whether you give your actual name or not, right? Things along those lines. But highly recommend. So next we're going to talk about anxiety disorders. And so anxiety disorders are rooted in fear, right? We just said Halloween. You know, we sort of think of fear almost in like a funny way when we think about Halloween. But fear or panic is a really basic emotion, and it involves the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight response. It enables us to quickly respond to actual dangerous threats, like a poisonous snake, a loaded gun, right? Actual threats. When this kicks in, it can save our lives. What happens in people with anxiety disorders is this system, the parasympathetic nervous system and the related brain structures, are overactive. They overreact to things that other people don't have that fight or flight response to. And they do it in a variety of ways, depending on which disorder you have. So fear and panic have three components. The first is the cognitive or subjective component. I feel terrified, right? Your own experience of what you're going through. Then there are physiological components like your heart rate speeding up, breathing more shallowly, things maybe shaking physically, right? And then there's the behavioral component of that strong urge to escape or to flee. So one thing I should say here is that not all anxiety is bad. It's only bad when it starts to interfere with your life. This is the Yerkes-Dodson law, which I believe was also mentioned in your chapter about motivation. It argues that there's an optimal point of anxiety or stress at which humans will perform well, but that too little or too much anxiety can lead to poor performance. So say you were studying for an in-class closed book test, right? If you were not at all anxious about that test, then you might not study at all, right? And then your performance would probably not be very good, right? On the other hand, if you are so paralyzed by test anxiety, overwhelmed, you might overstudy and like not get enough sleep and not be able to perform well as a result of that as well. So what they argue is somewhere in the middle, like being a little anxious about something, but not to the point that it paralyzes or overwhelms you, is where you get optimal performance. People who are pro athletes, multi-million-dollar recording artists will talk about how like this never quite goes away, like the stage jitters, and how that's a good thing, right? Because that helps them optimize their performance. So there are several types of anxiety disorders. Generalized anxiety disorder is the most commonly diagnosed, but I would say the least commonly talked about. It's sort of common vernacular. Phobias, I think, are probably one of the most commonly talked about, and panic disorder. And then prior to 2013 in that DSM-5, OCD and PTSD were classified as anxiety disorders, and now they each have their own categories. So now you have obsessive compulsive and related disorders, and I believe it's like stress related disorders where PTSD falls. But both of those certainly have a heart of anxiety in them. So we'll kind of talk about them in this context as well. So we'll start with GAD. And like I said, this is the most commonly diagnosed anxiety disorder, but one that like we don't normally talk about it here about. I think it's probably largely because it isn't necessarily that interesting to portray on screen, right? Something like a phobia, it's pretty easy to be like, oh, a spider, right? But GAD is characterized by excessive anxiety and worry about most circumstances and practically anything. So everything's internal, right? You're just thinking about these things over and over. That can be really hard to portray in sort of like a pop culture way. Often the concerns are like vague, but still intense. Like you're just worried about something bad happening. And it can be like a sort of free floating anxiety where you just get anxious about anything happening in your life. So symptoms of GAD, excessive anxiety and worry. To be diagnosed, you have to have it for at least 6 months. And about a number of different things, right? It's gotta be sort of generalized, hence generalized anxiety disorder. And the worry is difficult to control. Once you start worrying, you feel like you can't stop. And then you have to have 3 or more of these symptoms. So restlessness, always sort of feeling like you're keyed up or on edge, being fatigued. Some people will be fatigued because the anxiety will keep them up at night. And some will be just because like keeping your mental energy on that many worries all the time is exhausting, right? Difficulty concentrating because you're always worried about everything else. Irritability because you don't understand why the people around you are also not concerned about these things, right? Muscle tension is a big one, where it's like they just sort of like tense up all the time because they're so worried. So it can actually lead to like muscle aches and pains. And then sleep disturbance. Often they have a hard time falling asleep. Once they fall asleep, they might wake up in the middle of the night worried about things. And then again, significant distress or impairment and social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So about 4% of the general population will meet criteria for GAD. The females outnumber males approximately 2 to 1. It often is sort of like just creeps in. The onset is insidious, or it's like you might be worrying just sort of normally, and then you start worrying a little more, and then you start worrying a little more, and the next thing you know, it's sort of taken over your life. And the tendency to be anxious runs in families, and there is some now genetic evidence that GAD and other anxiety disorders might be genetic. All right, so phobias. A phobia is a persistent fear of some specific object or situation that presents little or no actual danger. And a person with a phobia will go to great lengths to avoid that feared object or situation, which will in turn lead to it interfering with normal functioning. So with a phobia, you've got to have some sort of feared stimulus and then avoidance of that. And then again, interfering with your normal functioning. And the main categories of phobias in the DSM are, the first one is specific phobia. And that's what we think of when we think of phobias. They involve fears of other species like snakes or spiders, or fears that arouse out of aspects of the environment like water, heights, things about the mind. Social anxiety disorder in the past has actually been called social phobia. And these involve fear of social situations where you're exposed to the scrutiny of others and you're afraid of humiliating yourself, essentially. For some people, this may be very specific to just like public speaking, but for other people, it can generalize to all social situations. And then the third category is agoraphobia. This literally translates to fear of the marketplace. And this stems from anxiety about having a panic attack, some sort of physical issue in public, and feeling like you can't escape and experiencing embarrassment. Some people with agoraphobia can still go out in public a lot of times. Some people become housebound because it's so severe. So there are 5 subtypes of those specific phobias. Animal, again, are the ones that we kind of think of in, Fear Factor and shows like that capitalize on it. Things like arachnophobia, right? Ophidiophobia, fear of snakes. But then for some people, it's gonna be things like fear of dogs, right? And then the natural environment I mentioned. Another is blood injection injury. So these are people who would have a fear of things like needles, going to the doctor's office, blood injuries. This can be really dangerous because it can mean people will not seek out medical care when they need it. Situational is a little more specific than the natural environment. This could be like fear of flying, fear of enclosed places, so like claustrophobia would fall here. And then there are sort of the atypical or other, so for example, one of these is a fear of choking or a fear of vomiting. Avoidance is a big part of phobias. People avoid the feared stimulus so they don't experience that dread and fear. And this avoidance behavior is reinforcing through the principles of negative reinforcement, which means you take away something that's unpleasant in order to have a behavior occur more often. So if you avoid your anxiety, then you're essentially reinforced by not having to experience it. And so then you're reinforced for not being anywhere where there might be snakes or spiders, right? And now the next thing you know, you like can't go anywhere in nature because there might be a spider, right? So then it sort of reinforces that feared response and you just have it more. There can also be secondary gains, although these are more rare. So if your phobia is so severe that it can actually interfere with your ability to do work, and then now you get like disability, that's a secondary gain. So these are the actual criteria. Pretty similar to what we just talked about. Social anxiety disorder is disabling fear of social situations. And the idea is they fear that they're going to embarrass themselves. They fear criticism by others. So they'll just avoid all social situations or specific social situations because they never gain the skills to know how to act in social situations. And so this obviously can get in the way of your ability to do your job. There's a couple of famous celebrities who have this are Barbara Streisand and Carly Simon. And so again, here are the symptoms. Yeah, I'll probably take these out because they just kind of repeat what we just talked about. Okay, agoraphobia. Like I said, this can be very crippling for some people. So it's a fear of being in public. So much so that at the extreme end, people just don't want to leave their house. Most of the time, this develops once you have had a panic attack or some sort of physical instance like a seizure, or if you have something like Crohn's disease, some sort of bowel incident in public. So like you've had that negative experience, you don't want to experience again, and that'll lead you to being anxious. They show a great deal of what's called interoceptive avoidance, which is when they're frightened of their own bodily sensations. So they'll actively avoid activities that will create that physiological arousal, like exercise, watching scary movies, drinking caffeine, things along those lines. You can have it without ever having a panic attack, but it's a little more rare. And in fact, it used to be you could only diagnose agoraphobia if someone also had panic disorder. That's not true anymore. So agoraphobia without panic is believed to happen when aspects of the environment begin to elicit fear, and this fear spreads to all or most environmental situations. And often this is related to medical conditions, again, like epilepsy or colitis. Again, here you see they have to be afraid of at least two of these situations. And they're just gonna, it's a lot of avoidance. Agoraphobia is sort of the poster child for avoidance. So panic disorder is where you have panic attacks. And now panic attacks can be really scary. a lot of physical symptoms go with panic attacks. And 90% of people who've had very severe panic attacks show up in the ER thinking they've had a heart attack. And so it can actually take months or sometimes years to get an actual diagnosis, because you don't want to not assume someone had a heart attack, right? Like that's not the safe way to do things. So they'll do all the workup for any kind of heart disease. And then they might end up, finally figuring out, oh, this might be psychological. And I don't have a slide for this, but I can read you some of the symptoms of panic attacks. So they come out of the blue and they result in worry, that you'll get this panic attack or that you're dying, something like that, or going crazy. So they peak within minutes and then they usually resolve in about 10 minutes or so. And it's an abrupt surge in intense fear or discomfort. And some of the symptoms are pounding heart, accelerated heart rate, sweating, shaking or trembling, shortness of breath, sensation of choking, chest pain or discomfort. You can see more and more why people think they're having a heart attack, right? Nausea or abdominal distress, dizziness, chills or heat sensations. Sometimes you'll get like tingling in your extremities, and feelings of loss of control or going crazy, feeling not connected to the world, and fear of dying. And notice that having a panic attack isn't a disorder in and of itself. See, a lot of adults will have panic attack sometime in their adult life, but never actually go on to be diagnosed with panic disorder because it was like a one-off. Panic disorder is when you essentially start to fear having panic attacks, and sometimes just that fear itself can lead to another panic attack. So essentially what happens in a panic attack is a huge overreaction of that fight or flight response. And then you start misinterpreting all these body signals. So everything that's going on here is just your body trying to prepare you to like fight or run away. So like your extremities tingle because it's shifting blood to like the big muscles, like your legs, things like that. You have all of the chest and heart sensations because your heart is working harder to pump blood around. You're breathing differently because you're trying to get more oxygen in. The dizziness is because, ironically, like blood flow slows to your brain because essentially your body's like, we don't have time to overthink this, let's just act, right? So all of those are just an overreaction of this fight or flight system that we all have. Alrighty, we will stop there for today and take up talking about OCD on Friday.